Hello and welcome to another video from the AHF. In this particular one, it's an article on can you use sharps for your sparring and should you? Now first of all, I must point out that sparring can mean different things to different people, but largely to us it would mean an actual competitive fight where you actually intentionally aim to strike your opponent in a way that would realistically incapacitate or kill them. So different people will think of sparring as different things altogether. There are all kinds of partner drills that some people would call sparring, but that's really open to interpretation. In terms of what I'm saying about what sparring is, it needs to be at least fairly competitive and therefore fairly close and realistic to the fight. Now, can you use sharps for that? I would say absolutely not. The reason people like to use sharps is they feel that a few things. One is the way that the blades actually interact with one another, and that's because the sharp edges, they tend to stick to one another. They bind quite well, so that they're quite sticky. They don't slide like a lot of blunts or sort of training swords do. And the other issue is they think that it's much more realistic because you've actually got a sense of danger involved. However, what I'd say to that is getting a sense of danger into your sparring can be a really useful practice. It can actually make you think a little bit more sensibly and a little bit more realistically about what you're doing. But when you're using sharps, you can never commit to actual serious attacks. You can never counter with realistic attacks or defences. There are loads of kind of counter time, stop hit stuff that can't be done. You can never counter with the point. You can't actually commit to attacks. Essentially, the one thing you can do is closely simulate slicing actions, and there is the risk from those slices. So in that, if you're going to say spar with sharps, you can to a degree have the risk of a slice, but you can never have the risk of an actual thrust or a cut because you're not actually able to commit to those attacks in the first place. And it's all very well to say, yeah, but you can pull your blows at the last minute, but realistically, with the kind of stuff we're actually training for, you can't pull those blows, and actually make it realistic. You can't, for example, have one person thrust in and the other person counter thrust in and stop that, because if you actually stop it, well, there was no real technique, there was no full technique in the first place. So what I'd say is, anything I've ever seen that actually is supposedly sparring with sharps is not really sparring with sharps. It's essentially a partner drill that is very, very specific in what you're actually training. Which takes us on to what could actually be useful to do with sharps. And I would say it is useful to understand and practice to see how they actually interact with one another. And the first thing I would say to that is don't do it unless you're very experienced in historical fencing and have experience with sharps. So I'm not advocating it, but it's a useful drill if you are very experienced in what you're doing, just to understand how the blades actually interact with one another. And that's the one thing you will see on YouTube with some videos is essentially two practitioners at wide measure, so not actually at striking distance, going through parries, counters and engagements of the blades that actually allow them to get a sense of what the danger could be like at wide measure and some of the psychology at that point, and also feel how the blades are interacting with one another and protecting themselves from the slices and sort of hand snipes and things like that. So yes, there are some drills that you can do with sharps that could be moderately useful, I would say. Although realistically, once you've done it once or twice, you know how those blades interact with one another. It's not really sort of rocket science. And then when it actually comes to your sparring, there are lots and lots of ways that you can actually try and make it, psychology-wise, a more realistic fight. And by that I mean there's more risk of you actually getting hurt, or at least the feeling that you might get hurt. A prime example I would give you is the Spez padded swords, like the padded sabres, which they look awful. They do look terrible. They look like some kind of LARP sort of sword. But there is actually some valuable lessons you can get from those. One of the things we've often done is spar with those, again, only our sort of instructors and advanced students, spar with them with no training gear at all, no masks. And yes, there's some risk of black eyes and things like that, and potentially even to lose teeth. So I'm, again, not advocating it, but if you're at that high level, experienced and willing to take the risks, yes, you can use those padded sabres, and then you'll actually get a real sense of the danger of taking a cut or a thrust, because it really does hurt. A full power Moulinet cut to the head with those sabres really will hurt you, and not in a long, sort of a permanent way or a long-standing sort of way, but you're really going to feel it at the time to the level you actually do protect yourself. So there are ways of doing it. That's just one example that we do occasionally. Another one would be to use synthetic swords only with very minimal protection, and by minimal I mean masks, gloves and elbow protection, which essentially is the priority, which means that again a lot of the impacts you're going to be taking are really going to hurt, they're going to bruise your body without doing permanent damage, and again will make you want to protect them. So there are a few ways that I would say, and we'll go into this in later videos, that you can try and make your fighting a bit more realistic, make your training more realistic, but I don't believe at all that sharps is the way to do it. Sharps there are some valuable lessons on, as I said, but it isn't actually sparring, and I don't believe that it's realistically competitive. So no, I would not use sharps for what we would call sparring, but at the high end of your practice, if you're very, very experienced and an advanced student or instructor, yes, consider using sharps in a controlled drill environment where you can get an understanding of how the blades interact with one another. So that's what I'm going to say about sharps for now. Thanks for watching.